All right. Good Monday, everyone. I'm Mark Rogers of Mark Rogers TV, and you have found your way to college football coast to coast. Check me out on YouTube. My channel is Mark Rogers TV. I talk nothing but college football all the time, 24/7, 365. So, college football season not yet concluded, so it's a good time to catch up with my channel and join the discussion. So that's the most important part of this, is to join the discussion, and let's talk some college football. So we have committed to this Blab show each and every Monday. This is just the third time. Every Monday, 1 o'clock Eastern time. Got a little bit of a late jump on things this time around, but 1 o'clock Eastern time every Monday to wrap up the weekend. Look forward to those college football playoff standings that come out later on Tuesday. So here I've got in front of me my top 25. Now, if you've seen me before, or if you haven't, I'm going to remind you my criteria for the top 25, and most importantly, that top 4 that everybody's looking at as being those college football playoff spots. So I will do this a little bit differently than the people that say, I'm choosing the best teams. There is no way of knowing who the best teams are. Those people who claim to know who the best teams are miss about 30 to 40% of their picks every Saturday. So if they know who the best teams are, then they wouldn't be picking the games wrong. You got to go by resume. You got to go by track record, and that's what we're doing right here. So we have some teams rated ahead of other teams that I think are better. I would right now, if I was headed to Vegas to bet on the College Football National Championship, I would bet on either Ohio State or Alabama. I think they're the two best teams, the most talented teams, the best coach teams. Alabama's lost a game. Therefore, they're not in the top 2 spots. For some reason, people forget that. And then if we're looking at performance, they also did not perform well against fairly marginal, decent Tennessee and Arkansas teams. So Alabama would not be in my top 2, or you shall see where I do have Alabama rated. So again, who did you beat? Who did you lose to? And if you lost a game or two, how competitive were those games? So your performance on the field means everything. And then we've got how competitive you were. I'm not projecting results, so I'm not projecting down the road, and I'll get to the call here in just a second. I'm not projecting down the road. So a lot of people do that in projecting a top 25 or selecting the top 25 or the top 4. They're projecting, well, I think Ohio State's going to beat Michigan, Michigan State, or whatever the case might be. They project. I'm basing it on the track record as it stands right now. So here's my top 25. Mississippi State's 25, Ole Miss 24, Memphis 23, Wisconsin 22, Washington State 21, USC at 20, Northwestern 19, LSU 18, Michigan 17, Florida State number 16, Utah's at 15, Stanford's 14. At number 13, I've got the undefeated Houston Cougars with a big win over Memphis on Saturday. Number 12, nobody's talking about North Carolina. 11, TCU. 10 is Baylor. 9, Michigan State. Oklahoma at 8. Notre Dame 7. All right, I've got Florida at 6. Alabama's at 5. Top 4, here we go. Oklahoma State at 4. Ohio State 3. Yes, the Iowa Hawkeyes are number 2, and Clemson's number 1. Again, don't want to hear anybody argue with me about who the best teams are. We can argue that, and we can discuss and debate it. I'm not basing this on who I think are the best teams. It's who has the best track record. Write in your comments on the side there. We can certainly talk some college football or join the open seat. Better yet. So again, my top 25. Join me on Mark Rogers TV on YouTube. That's my channel there. Join me on Twitter as well, Mark Rogers TV. And we'll talk it up also with Facebook. Who did you beat? Who did you lose to? So for those teams that have lost a game or two, how competitive were you against good teams? Did you suffer a bad loss like Oklahoma? So I've got them down at number 8. They're still in striking distance, obviously, with the Baylor win being very impressive from last Saturday night on the road, winning by 10 points, and then playing TCU in Norman this week. So Oklahoma can, again, notch another impressive win. How competitive were you? I'm not projecting here. I'm talking about track record to date. A lot has been made of the Iowa Hawkeyes. If you compare Iowa's schedule and Ohio State's schedule to date, I'm not talking about Michigan State coming up for Ohio State in 2 weeks. Talking about to date, Iowa has made its way to a 10-0 record against a more difficult schedule than Ohio State. It's not even really that close. Pitt, decent football team out of conference, a team that beat Virginia Tech, the best team Ohio State beat, non-conference. Iowa has also defeated in conference Northwestern and Penn State. The only comparable game right there, the only game that both teams have played out of those teams would be Penn State. Ohio State and Iowa also both played Minnesota. Similar outcomes. Similar. Ohio State needed a late touchdown to pull away 28-14 at home. Iowa, similar circumstance, was typically up by 1 to 2 scores throughout the second half in defeating Minnesota. I've heard the transitive property used in these debates, and it can be used. And I'm not saying that I've never used the transitive property, but you got to be careful there. Because as soon as you say this team beat that team and that team beat this team, then you got to be willing to use that argument in all directions, most notably with Alabama. Alabama lost to Ole Miss. Ole Miss lost to Memphis. Memphis lost to Navy. Memphis also lost to Houston. Houston's undefeated. Alabama's lost a game. Do we rate Houston above Alabama because Houston beat Memphis? Memphis beat Ole Miss. Ole Miss beat Alabama. Transitive property. I think now at this point in the season, we've got 10 games played. We can look at track record and resume. Not that the transitive property can't work, especially if it works multiple times for one team. You can say a number of times, well, not just in one direction can we take the transitive property, but we can take it about using about 4 different teams in 4 different scenarios. Then it possibly works because we're talking about a track record. Okay, big happenings over the weekend. Stanford going down at home against Oregon 38-36. The Cardinal, I would still consider to be a top 5 to 10 team, but they have basically knocked themselves out of the college football playoffs with 3 second-half turnovers, 2 by Kevin Hogan on snaps. Oregon wins the game having thrown just 12 passes, but they made them count. Vernon Adams, 10 for 12 for Oregon. Royce Freeman ran wild, and the Cardinal lose 38-36. That's a second loss for what was, for a lot of people, kind of a chic pick after the Northwestern debacle in week 1 to recover and make it all the way, a la Ohio State last season, to the national championship game with 1 loss. But Stanford, now with 2 losses, would need all sorts of hell to break loose elsewhere to get to the college football playoff. Same thing with Utah. So the Pac-12 has pretty much played its way out of the college football playoff with the Utes losing at Arizona. And if you can't beat a Wildcats team, I know a new Solomon's back, and that means the world of difference for Arizona, but still, this is a top 40 or 50 team. So if Utah can't go on the road and they lose to Arizona, they have no business being in the college football playoff. Arizona has been awful at times this season, most notably against UCLA, Stanford, and Washington, 49-3. So those are the happenings on the West Coast, and now the West Coast and the Pac-12 is going to be largely ignored, other than Stanford lining up against Notre Dame in a couple weeks to possibly ruin the Irish's season. Clemson in the ACC seems to be coasting home. They defeated Syracuse at the Dome unimpressively, but still maintain the number 1 spot in the college football playoff standings, I would assume, coming out Tuesday night, and also in my standings. Clemson has Wake Forest coming up. They've got the game against South Carolina, usually a very difficult game. Dabo Swinney and his predecessor had lost 5 or 6 consecutive games until last year to South Carolina, but Clemson a decided favorite in that one. But I expect it might be a difficult tussle against South Carolina. Then Clemson lines up against North Carolina, a team no one is talking about. I hear no one talking about, except I was talking about it 5 or 6 weeks ago, saying, look at North Carolina sitting there. Then they started to knock off some decent teams in the ACC Coastal. Not great teams, but Pitt and Georgia Tech. so forth and so on. They annihilated Duke a couple weeks ago with 66 points. Now North Carolina is starting to push their way up the rankings. I have them at number 12, and they've got a date at Virginia Tech. Look out. Upset alert at Virginia Tech for North Carolina. I believe that's a Thursday night game. Maybe I'm getting that confused with last Thursday night, Georgia Tech, Virginia Tech. Anyway, North Carolina playing at Virginia Tech coming up this weekend. The Tar Heels, again, just the one loss. And if we treat North Carolina like we treat a lot of teams, that week one loss is almost like a half a loss. South Carolina, I know South Carolina's not that good, but South Carolina has certainly made it difficult for the likes of Tennessee and Texas A&M and Florida to a certain extent. It was a one-score game in the fourth quarter. So can we forgive North Carolina for losing by 4 points at South Carolina in a game in which I'm not going to say they dominated the game, but they were the much better team for most of the game. But through 3 interceptions from Marquise Williams, I believe 2 in the end zone, gave up a late touchdown run to lose that one again, 17-13. That was way back in August. And the opener, North Carolina, South Carolina. But the Tar Heels have ripped off, since then, 9 consecutive wins. And they play Virginia Tech this week. They've got a date against North Carolina State. So they've got 2 decent victories ahead of them if they can take care of business. And then the ACC championship game. Think about the scenario if North Carolina, sitting right now, I've got them at 13. They were 23 in the college football playoff standings last week. How high did they rise after a game against Miami, a marginal Miami team? So let's say North Carolina goes up to 15 or 16 in the playoffs rankings, I should call them, not standings, rankings. How does that line them up for a North Carolina State and especially an ACC championship game against Clemson finish? Can they vault all the way from out of the rankings after 8 or 9 weeks all the way to the top 4? Well, if they beat number 1, neutral site. Ohio State, Michigan State coming up. Connor Cook did not play the second half of the Spartans game against Maryland, but he says he's going to be fine. He's got a shoulder that's a bit aggravated, and I would think that Mark Antonio thought that the game against Maryland was in hand, didn't blow him out, but that he was confident enough that they would win, plus Connor Cook obviously very much in pain and discomfort and didn't have the mobility in that shoulder required to play. So he took a 6 for 20 first half into the locker room, didn't see the field. Tyler O'Connor, not to be confused with Connor Cook, Tyler O'Connor took over in the second half, and it was a pretty dismal effort for Michigan State offensively. Didn't gain 300 yards, only threw 11 passes with O'Connor in the game in the second half. He threw a touchdown, threw a pick. But Connor Cook should be back in the lineup in Columbus for the big one at 3:30. Ohio State, Michigan State, the Buckeyes backloaded schedule. Here it comes. This might be the most difficult stretch for any team in college football if Ohio State makes it all the way through. Michigan State at Michigan, Big Ten championship game against Iowa. So most likely after 9-1 Michigan State, they will have 9-2 Michigan, then most likely a 12-0 Iowa team waiting for them in Indianapolis. So the Buckeyes finally play some teams. Probably their most difficult game to date was either Virginia Tech or probably Penn State. Penn State at 7-3, could be 8-2 if they would have been able to make some better clock management decisions late against Northwestern. So again, what do you think of my top 4? I got Clemson, Iowa, Ohio State, Oklahoma State. So the controversial pick there for a lot of people would be Alabama left out at this point. But with an Iron Bowl game against a decent Auburn team and with Florida in the championship game, Alabama wins 2 games, even in my rankings, which of course don't mean anything, but they're fun to talk about. And I love to point out where I believe that the committee has missed it. Although I've said this a number of times, the committee has an impossible job. 4 spots, 5 conferences. 5 conferences, not even counting the likes of the group of five, plus Notre Dame, plus any second place finishers in major conferences that could be, I hate to use the word deserving, had earned a spot. And we saw what happened last season. People think that the selection of Ohio State was justified because they won the national championship. I don't look at it that way. You can't look in hindsight. We don't know what Baylor or TCU would have done in a college football playoff situation. Anyway, jump on board. Mark Rogers TV, this is College Football Coast to Coast, number 3. This is your 3rd edition. So we will join you every Monday at 1 o'clock Eastern time to talk up some college football. So please join me here. Also join me on Twitter at Mark Rogers TV, and also join me on YouTube at Mark Rogers TV as well. We're about to wrap it up. I've given you my college football playoff standings as I see it. These are my rankings and my justification of who'd you beat, who'd you lose to, for getting the eye test, because we all pick games wrong. So I have discussions with people all week that say, I picked so-and-so over so-and-so, even though they've got a worse record and they haven't played as good a schedule, because I think they would beat them. And these are people that predict games and miss 30 or 40% of them. Think about this. Ohio State, if we were relying on Vegas odds and point spreads to determine who the best teams in the country are to select for this 14 playoff, Ohio State wouldn't have been there last year. Ohio State was an underdog in the Big Ten championship game against Wisconsin, who was 13th or 14th ranked in the country. So Ohio State, if we're relying on Vegas to tell us who the 4 best teams are, Ohio State was an underdog against Wisconsin, Alabama, and Oregon. A fairly significant underdog, not 1 or 2 points. Fairly significant underdog. 4 points against Wisconsin, a full touchdown against Alabama at least, and about a 5-point underdog against Oregon. All right, folks, this has been Mark Rogers TV, College Football Coast to Coast. Please join me each and every Monday at 1 o'clock Eastern time right here on Blab. See you next time.